Is it a matter of A2 brute, or is John Roberts a perverse genius? I'm Allen Barton. Stand by for the front page. Joining me in studio, Adam Summers, Senior Policy Analyst for the Reason Foundation, Don Watkins, a Fellow at the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights, and Bryan, Preston, Editor of the PJ Tatler. All right, Bryan, I'll start with you.
Sure.
Judas or genius? What is John Roberts? What was he doing?
You know, I think we're all still trying to figure this out, and the divide in the country right now is about 46-46 on this. Right now, I'm coming down lightly on the side of genius, but only because of the political, mainly because of the political aspects of this, which is how I tend to look at these things. If you look at the precedent set, Judas might be more accurate. So well, it's all still shaking out.
Adam, I'll go to you. You know, he's talking about the precedent set, but a lot of conservatives are saying, well, hold on a second. The government powers of taxation have always been extremely broad. And basically, Roberts threw another bone towards that general area. But he did eviscerate the idea of using the Commerce Clause as a backdoor to increase government power. He eviscerated the idea that the feds can bully the states by withholding funds on certain programs to ensure compliance. And the power of taxation, you know, they've always had that. It was always pretty broad. And if they have to list this thing as a tax, politically, much more difficult to get passed. So it's an interesting idea about what he was really doing here.
There may have been broad tax power, but it's completely unlimited if there was any question of that before. And you know, regardless of whether you talk about the individual mandate as a provisions as a penalty or a fine or a tax, the fact is that the government can force you to buy a product you don't want to buy, whether you're trying to define it under the Commerce Clause or not. Government has that power to coerce you into buying something you don't want to buy. If you want to call it a tax or a fine, I don't think it's really relevant. The underlying issue is the force of government interfering with the decisions of individuals.
Look at where we are for a second. This is the situation. If the Constitution means anything, it means the government can't go around just dictating this is what you should buy, these are the kinds of arrangements and contracts you should engage in. Here's where we are today. Today, if it's activity, the government can regulate any way it wants. If it's inactivity, the government can tax you into doing it. Where is there any room for freedom?
Well, I think it's certainly an interesting problem, because if healthcare had been billed as a tax, would never have been passed. Never. Not in a million years would not have been passed. And I'm wondering whether Roberts sort of is saying, look, this is really a political issue, and one in which the populace, the citizenry, needs to be more involved. And if they can't say it's a mandate, it's a fee, it's a this, it's a that essentially all of this is taxation. And taxation is much harder to pass, whether he hasn't dealt a pretty serious blow to passing such odious legislation in the future, and certainly not under the Commerce Clause. But there's this whole issue of tax mandate, and Obama, of course, famously talked to George Stephanopoulos a couple years ago about the healthcare law and taxation. Let's take a look at it.
Merriam-Webster's dictionary. Tax, a charge usually of money imposed by authority on persons or property for public purposes.
George, the fact that you looked up Merriam's dictionary, the definition of tax increase, indicates to me that you're stretching a little bit right now. Otherwise, you wouldn't have gone to the dictionary to check on the definition.
Well, no,
I mean, if what you're saying is...
I wanted to check for myself, but your critics say it is a tax increase.
My critics say everything's a tax increase. My critics say that I'm taking over every sector of the economy. You know that. Look, we can have a legitimate debate about whether or not we're going to have an individual mandate or not. But
you reject that it's a tax increase.
I absolutely reject that notion.
I've always loved the idea that he was criticizing the use of a dictionary. You know, like, how dare you use a dictionary to look up the objective meaning of words, George? We don't deal in the objective meaning of words. You're reaching. You're reaching if you're looking.
Depends on what the definition of it is.
And then, yeah, exactly. Right. And then that thing like, my critics say I'm trying to take over the government. Huh. Exactly. Bryan, what do you think of this idea of tax mandate, the big debate here?
Well, you know? When I was the communications director at the bomb-throwing Republican Party of Texas, we described the individual mandate as a tax. That was the language we used. That was the language the party used all the way up to the top, because it was, in fact, a tax. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court may have snookered the left yesterday a little bit, even though it's the left that actually bought the argument, that it is a tax. And it has reframed the campaign now. Instead of talking about Obamacare, you'll hear more talk about Obama tax, because he has now been found by the Supreme Court to have levied a massive, onerous, job-destroying tax on a weak economy. The campaign going forward has changed from yesterday.
Adam, speaking of the campaign, what do you think Romney can do with this? I mean, obviously he has his own liabilities with ObamaCare, blah, 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 blah. But does this, in a way, frame the debate differently for him going forward?
Well, I think the argument that Romney is going to make is I'm the only way that you can get rid of this this mandate and this legislation is to vote for me. I wouldn't poo-poo his own record on this. However, it's going to be really hard to get charged up to vote for a guy who did basically the same thing in his state, and you can say, well, it was more of a states' rights issue, but in the end, his instinct was to go to government and compel people to do things that he wanted them to do. And so I think you're going to have a real hard time charging up the base as much as maybe some of the pundits have been saying.
Well, Don, the guy raised like $5 million in about 5 minutes after this ruling. He says, look, his history is his history. He says he's going to repeal this thing. What do you think the debate should be? Let's take it away from Romney, Obama in the particulars, because each of them can be looked at as hypocrites. What should the debate be for Americans going forward?
Well, the debate should be we need to limit government. And today it's very clear that government hasn't been limited. And so I think it's an open question whether Romney would or wouldn't veto it. But the problem is that the right largely shares the goals of the left. So they say, yeah, we got to get rid of Obamacare, but we need to guarantee that people who have pre-existing conditions are covered. We need to stop price discrimination in insurance. In other words, they want to do everything that the left has set out, but they just want to tweak it a little bit. So a real debate would have to really challenge that and say, no, the government has no role here. We should be free to make our own choices, and that includes be free to engage in medical businesses, including health insurance, without controls by the government. If you make that debate and you could actually defend it, you have a real shot at freedom and not just repealing Obamacare.
Well, the problem is the Republicans kind of lost the whole moral high ground back when they pushed through the whole Medicare prescription drug plan. I mean, that was a huge increase.
Yeah, but it feels like, to a certain degree, the rise of the Tea Party in 2009, the Republicans have found religion in the area of fiscal responsibility. At least they're saying it when they won in a landslide in 2010 and passed a lot of legislation in the House that's all stopped by the Senate, but a lot of legislation that I think we'd be in favor of, given, it's not what we would want in terms of a pure system where we just get rid of government involvement, but they passed a lot of good legislation that's being stopped by the Senate. So it would seem to me that the criticisms of George Bush, while valid, are no longer apply, at least as long as the Tea Party holds their feet to the fire.
Well, I think there's still kind of a disconnect between the grassroots conservative and Tea Party support and the actual elected officials. Now they're making the Tea Party's kind of making inroads, and so we are starting to see a little bit more representation of that limited government type of view. But I think it's going to take quite a bit more before you're actually able to get the Republican Party elected officials to kind of clamp down on the growth of the size and scope of government.
Yeah, well, it's been an emotional roller coaster. Yesterday morning, I was so angry. I was playing tennis. By the end of the tennis lesson, I missed my last shot. I smashed my racket into a million pieces, which I never do. Smashed it into a million pieces, cursing John Roberts in the Supreme Court. My tennis teacher was like, "What are you doing?" And by the end of the day, I was starting to think perverse genius, but maybe I'm just an optimist. For Bryan, Adam, and Don, I'm Allen Barton. You've been watching Front Page.